you have some health condition or your energy is just a little bit low. If you think back to high school biology, you may have heard of a certain kind of organelle called the mitochondria, aka the powerhouse of the cell. When that component within cells has issues, it can manifest in a bunch of different ways. And in this episode, we discuss everything you should know about that organelle, how the mitochondria are much more than just power plants, the potential consequences of biological energy shortages, of mitochondria not doing their job adequately, the other response that they can have when the conditions are not optimal so that they protect you from what they perceive to be stressors or threats. That's right. In many ways, mitochondria are environmental sensors. And when you're under threat, they activate what's called the cell danger response. But before you rush off to optimize your mitochondria, you'll want to follow a specific order of operations. Otherwise, you may be overriding the body's protective mechanisms, which may cause more harm than good. We discuss another part of the cell that's rarely discussed called peroxisomes. We talk about the role of the immune system. We cover the topics of stealth infections, pathogenic reactivation, and the consequences mold exposure can have on your mitochondria and overall health. We touch on the bioenergetic paradigm of producing insufficient cellular energy. And we talk about some of the flashier mitochondrial biohacks, such as bioregulators and what's known as Brown's gas, which is basically just an upgraded form of molecular hydrogen. Joining us on the podcast this week is Dr. Tim Jackson. He's a doctor of physical therapy and orthopedic rehabilitation. He's a functional medicine provider with a bachelor's of science in health science and chemistry from Wake Forest University. He serves clients in over 15 countries through his telehealth practice and has helped thousands over the past 8 years. He's been featured in all of the major biohacking podcasts, media outlets, health summits, and even a documentary. Of the many health-related topics, he specializes in digestive health, energy, autoimmune disorders, mold toxicity, and the main topic of this podcast, mitochondria. The show notes for everything we discussed today will be at mindbodypeak.com/162. And if you want to learn a little bit more about optimizing your mitochondria, I will include a link to an article I wrote on exactly that. So check out the show notes to connect with our guest this week or to expand your knowledge on improving one of the core factors of building lifelong sustainable health. Okay, enjoy this conversation with Dr. Tim Jackson. Dr. Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Nick. I really appreciate it.
Today, we're going to dive into a number of different fascinating topics. But before we get started, let's begin with your unusual non-negotiables you've done so far today for your health, your performance, and your bioharmony.
Yes. So first thing this morning, when I got up, it was right at 6 a.m., just before 6 a.m. There was no sunlight out yet, so I kept my blue blockers on. Then about 30 minutes later, sunlight came out. So I went out, got 30 minutes roughly of morning sunlight to help train my circadian rhythm and increase my dopamine levels for the day. Then as I was working this morning on my computer, I hooked myself up to my molecular hydrogen machine and breathed in the gas, which helps with mitochondrial health, as you know, and it's anti-inflammatory. And so far, that's all I've done for my health today. Other days, I have a red light therapy device I use 5 to 6 times a week, a sauna upstairs, vibration plate, a Lumen photon machine, and I kind of mix and match depending on what my goals are.
That's awesome. I didn't realize that you also have a molecular hydrogen device. I've recorded several podcasts on that. It's a really fascinating therapeutic. Do you notice much difference from using it?
Yeah, so I had another one, but then this one is the AquaCure. It's the
Oh yeah,
Brown's
I
gas
have one
machine.
right below me.
Yeah. And so, they have the goggles. I haven't used those yet to improve my eyesight. But I breathe the gas. I drink the water, but I probably breathe the gas more because it's just more convenient. And yeah, my lifts have gone up in the gym. It helps me with recovery. I notice better cognition, even when, it's not optimal to have less than 8 hours of sleep. But on days that I do, I notice that I don't really miss a beat if I'm using the molecular hydrogen.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of those therapies and substances you can use to help offset some of the detrimental effects of sleep deprivation because it's inevitable that some days we won't get quite as much sleep as we want. And yeah, when I was traveling didn't have access to the AquaCure, and now that I'm back, it's really nice. I find that it's a good pick me up too if I use it in the afternoon for some steady energy without the crash.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so small that molecular hydrogen gets into the mitochondria. And I think that's what makes it so unique.
Yeah. And again, I've recorded several different podcasts with George Wiseman, the inventor of AquaCure, and one with Alex Tavarna from Drink HRW on molecular hydrogen. So those resources I'll put in the show notes. But you've mentioned mitochondria several times already. We'll talk a lot about that today because it's a very important topic. And most people have probably not heard that term since high school biology class, where it's called the powerhouse of the cell. Can you break down what exactly are mitochondria and why do they matter?
Yeah. So, like you said, in high school biology, middle school biology, we get taught they're the powerhouse of the cell. Even in my first undergrad biology class, I think they were referred to as that. But then you go further and further into cell and molecular biology and you realize there's a whole lot more to them. Looking back, if they would have taught me like, okay, you can use these things to improve the mitochondria, I would have been much more likely to study. I mean, I did fine, but I think more people would take an interest if they knew that they could use these tools and these concepts to improve their life. But to operationally define the mitochondria, they are the batteries of the cells. They produce the energy currency of the cells. But when you look at every disease known to man, one of the things they all have in common is mitochondrial dysfunction. But one of the other more important, well, equally important roles of the mitochondria is to send out danger signals. And so when the cell is under threat, whether it's from a virus or a bacteria or a high environmental toxin load or even psychological stress, it activates something called the cell danger response. And so basically, if your mitochondria is here, it can go down this route and that's going to produce ATP, or it can go down this route where it's sending out danger signals. And so a lot of the times we think, we need to boost the mitochondria, and to some degree we do, but we need to find out why it's not producing energy. And so we got to work on removing the threats, whether it's psychological stress, perceived stress, physiological stress, non-native EMFs, Wi-Fi, 5G, things like that can all activate the cell danger response. And so it's a sensing mechanism to kind of determine what's going on in the environment, as well as producing energy. But, I tell people if you want to be smarter, work on your mitochondria. You want to run faster, work on your mitochondria. You want to lift more weights, work on your mitochondria. You want to have better sleep, work on your mitochondria.
The way I like to think of it is like the mitochondria are like a nuclear energy plant. And if you're creating energy, that's great. You're powering up all the different bodily systems and functions. And if there's a threat, any threat, then when you activate the cell danger response, it's like saying, well, it's more important that we survive. So we're going to shut down production or reduce production at this nuclear energy plant so that everything stays okay. And yes, it's going to cause an expense of lack of power. And in the body's case, when there's a lack of power to different organ systems, they don't perform as well. And you might notice, depending on your genetics, your constitution, your epigenetics, a bunch of different factors, you'll see different symptoms as a result, whether it's migraines, whether it's muscle weakness, it's brain fog, it's rapid aging. So those are all like stemming from the same issue potentially, although the symptoms present differently.
Yeah. So typically, the first place you'll notice mitochondrial dysfunction is in the brain and central nervous system. So the brain has between 9 and 10% of the body's mitochondria, but it utilizes between 20 and 24% of the body's oxygen that we breathe in. So you have basically a small number of mitochondria consuming a large amount of energy. So when there's dysfunction, it can be something as simple as brain fog, or maybe some memory issues, or maybe you're not processing information as quickly. But the other organs that are very mitochondrially dense, heart, and the gut and liver. And so the heart, a lot of times, we think congestive heart failure, oh, well, they're going to die. Like there's really nothing you can do. But things like CoQ10, testosterone, growth hormone, taurine, they all improve cardiac output, which is the number of liters of blood the heart pumps per minute. And it should be 5 liters per minute. And so people typically think, oh, testosterone, if someone's on testosterone replacement therapy, they're damaging their heart. But it's actually the opposite, because you're improving cardiac output. And testosterone is also responsible for something called reverse cholesterol transport. So it picks cholesterol up from the arteries and takes it back to the liver to be processed.
It sounds like there's a whole perspective called the bioenergetic perspective, and it places the mitochondria and energy production at the forefront. And that's why we also heard in recent times, especially in podcasts and other interviews, just how important they are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so it all speaks to sort of this metabolic theory. Pretty much every disorder has a metabolic component. So if you're metabolically healthy, your chances of any disorder or disease goes down significantly. And so, the more we're producing energy, obviously there's a strong connection between thyroid hormone and mitochondrial health. So you have T4 inactive thyroid hormone, T3, the more active form, and then we have a small amount of T2 that gets directly into the mitochondria. And so when we talk about autophagy, which is cellular cleansing and, basically housekeeping, so to speak, that is controlled largely by your free T3, your free active thyroid hormone levels. And so a lot of times as we age, thyroid hormone, our levels start to decline. Turns out the cells in the thyroid are very sensitive to oxidative stress. And so you almost never see a thyroid issue without also seeing an adrenal gland issue. And so you can have really high cortisol or really low cortisol, and that will drag the thyroid down with it. And so if you've probably heard of people who are prescribed thyroid medication and they take it and they get heart palpitations, it's not that they don't need it. It's just that you've got to look at the entire picture. If someone's cortisol is low, that's the body's way of saying, whoa, we can't handle this metabolic rate right now.
Yeah. Or high too.
Yeah. Or high. Exactly.
Have you heard of peroxisomes? What's the relationship between them and mitochondria? Because I've been reading about the synergy, or how they are co-organelles and they work together. And by manipulating peroxisomes specifically, it's like the lower hanging fruit to get bigger return on your mitochondrial improving efforts.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that happen prior to mitochondrial dysfunction. Endoplasmic reticulum stress is one of them, but you have the peroxisome. So there's other organelles. The issue becomes the technology is not readily available outside of a few select, research centers here and there. But I think in general, if you can do the basics for all the organelles. So on my podcast, I interviewed Dr. Dan Goodenow with the Prodrome Plasmalogen Company. And, he says that the plasmalogen deficiencies are really what's causing the organelle dysfunction. And they're incorporated into all the membranes, not just the cellular membrane, but the nuclear membrane, the mitochondrial membrane. And so it affects all the organelles. And so replenishing those plasmalogens is one of the things. I haven't started taking them yet, but I'm going to order some.
Will you define what they are?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So plasmalogens, it has an alkylglycerol backbone, and then it either has an omega-3 fatty acid or an omega-9 fatty acid. And so they're all throughout the body. They're made by the Schwann cells and the oligodendrocytes, which are two types of cells in the nervous system. They make the myelin, and the plasmalogens impact the white matter in the central nervous system. And so neurological disorders play a role, or with plasmalogens. So does autism, um, cancer, MS, heart disease, even. And it all gets back to, what we're looking at from the 30,000-foot view is ultimately happen at the cellular level, but then after that, the organelle level.
And what I read is that by stimulating the cellular cleanup process of autophagy and then fasting for a bit and then adding in omega-3 fatty acids specifically, and I think pterostilbene's another one, you can improve the recycling process that occurs within the peroxisomes. I think it's called pixophagy,
Yeah.
pixophagy, and that is supposed to also help with the mitochondrial recycling process.
Yeah. And so, a lot of people are into intermittent fasting, and that's great. The only thing I would say is you have to work on your metabolic flexibility, which is, so I'll define that, your ability to switch between substrates. So, when glucose is not available, can you use fatty acids, things like that. And a lot of times people will jump to intermittent fasting, but it's a hormetic stressor like sauna, like red light therapy. But your body, if it has a high allostatic load, which is the total number of stressors, both externally and internally on the body, then you may not benefit as much as you're expecting from intermittent fasting.
So what you're saying is that if you're very stressed out and then you add intermittent fasting on top of that, then you might actually have more downsides and detrimental effects than you do benefits.
Yeah, it's just like going to the gym and working out. Like I hear people say all the time, well, I had a stressful day today, so I'm going to go crush it in the gym. But you actually want to dial down the volume on the days you're really stressed because you want to create the same metabolic stimulus, but the volume is what determines whether it's a true stressor or not and whether you can adapt. And so, yeah, it's just all about context and looking at the person's lifestyle, their environment, their social connections, their nutrition, internal stressors, all those things, because what might be overtraining to me may not be overtraining to you, and vice versa.
Let's go back to mitochondria, and I want to talk more about how you know if your mitochondria are optimal, any signs or symptoms, and like to make sure that we're not going down that route of the cell danger response. Because as you mentioned earlier, the very first thing you do before you're trying to boost the mitochondria, their function and their output and everything, is to make sure that when you add more fuel, it's going down the right pathway. And instead of going down the danger response, where it's like almost like an emergency valve where the steam is escaping.
Well, there's a number of variables that are stressors that can activate the cell danger response. Um, Lyme disease, the co-infections, mold toxicity, high viral load. And a lot of people listening, they may think, well, I'm not running a fever and I don't have a cough. Those are very acute signs. But a lot of times, I haven't yet to test someone, excuse me, who didn't have at least two or three pathogens that were active because of the environment we live in, the chemical exposures, the non-native EMFs, the stress level. And so the pathogens, if we can decrease the pathogen load and decrease the toxicity level, the body and the mitochondria specifically are less likely to be in the cell danger response. So if you want to test, I mean, as far as I know, there's no direct test, but an indirect test, extracellular ATP. So the ATP, the energy currency of the cell, we want that to be in the cell, right? And so when it's outside the cell and in the plasma, then that's indicative of the cell danger response.
Is that a blood test you can get?
Yeah. Not a very common one. You don't hear about it much, but last time I checked, which was a few months ago, it was available from LabCorp and I think Quest as well.
So the first thing to do is to test to make sure you don't have a bunch of ATP in the extracellular fluid. Where do you go from that? Like, are there a lot of false positives or false negatives?
So with that, I don't think so. I mean, I think there's some, like with any test, but I don't think it's off the charts or anything. Um, but in terms of rehabilitating the mitochondria, a lot of people just try to put more and more fuel or AKA substrates into the body, and that's part of it. But we also want to repair those mitochondrial membranes and the cell membranes. So the plasma or cell membrane we want to use things like phosphatidylcholine, omega-3 fatty acids. And then for the mitochondrial membrane, we can use, and the cell membrane, plasmalogens, which we just referenced, and MT factor energy, which is a phospholipid complex. Dr. Garth Nicholson, it's based off of his work. And so a lot of toxins, especially some from pesticides, will lodge in that mitochondrial membrane. Things like MT factor energy help to kind of displace it and make the membrane healthy again. So part of it is a structural rehabilitation process, just like remodeling your house, so to speak. And then you can provide the fuel and substrates like coenzyme Q10, L-carnitine, oxaloacetate, NAD+, and then protecting it. So a really important point for the listeners and viewers, the mitochondrial DNA, it's not protected by those big round proteins we call histones. So our nuclear DNA is protected from oxidative stress to a degree by those histones. The mitochondrial DNA does not have those proteins. So it's much more susceptible to oxidative stress. And so the two main guardians of the mitochondria, glutathione and superoxide dismutase.
What about melatonin?
Melatonin is an important one as well. I interviewed John Lawrence, and he's big on the melatonin suppositories. And Dr. Deanna Minnick, she and some colleagues published a paper, I think 8 or 9 months ago, on mitochondrial melatonin production. And so, a lot of it's produced there, but that gets into sort of your light environment, right? So, I'm okay with supplementing with melatonin, but there's no getting away from the need for natural sunlight, right? Like that's a non-negotiable. But to rehab the mitochondria, we've got the structural component, we got the substrate component, and then we got the antioxidant / bodyguard component.
And for the structural component, it probably also is going to be important to make sure that you're getting the right fats that your body's going to use to produce the membranes.
Absolutely. So, you need a balance of omega-3s, omega-6. There's a new fatty acid. So I was interviewing someone the other day and she taught me about C15, fatty 15, which I haven't taken yet. I was just reading about it this morning. But that's supposed to be even better than omega-3s. But I take a high DHA fish oil because DHA can be converted into EPA, but the reverse isn't true. So EPA cannot be converted into DHA. And so when people say, EPA is for systemic issues and DHA is for brain health, it's a little misleading. It's not quite that simple. But the omega-3s, and, important point here is that a lot of times if you're taking high quality omega-3 and you're not noticing benefits, you're likely not digesting, absorbing, and assimilating your fats. And that's where using things like ox bile or TUDCA and digestive enzymes with lipase in it. That way you can break down the fatty acids and they can go to wherever they're needed the most and be incorporated into those membranes. And so that speaks to the larger issue of cellular communication. So if I have a cell here and it's really healthy and a cell here that's really healthy, but they can't communicate, then, I'm in trouble. And so, the saying, no man's an island, no cell is an island either. So they got to be able to talk to each other and, like the cell danger response, warn each other of danger signals. Fuel is scarce in the environment, so it can downregulate energy production. But yeah, those fatty acids, they're all important. Phosphatidylcholine. So without phosphatidylcholine, we can't make bile. Without bile, we can't detoxify. There's a polymorphism, MTHFD1, where we don't make as much phosphatidylcholine as we probably should. And so taking it orally is a good idea. There's a protocol called the Patricia Cain protocol, which we used to do in one of the clinics I worked at with IV therapy, but you can also do it orally. And it basically rehabilitates the cell membranes using a blend of fatty acids, phosphatidylcholine, butyrate, and it gets rid of these lipid rafts that when you change the structure of a fatty acid or a protein, it changes the functionality. And so that's what that whole protocol is based upon. And you can do it IV with IV therapy or orally. But yeah, the fatty acids, they're incredibly important.
Yeah. And I think the whole trend that the bioenergetic community has been talking about for a while about odd chain lipids like C15, for example, fatty 15, those are only going to become more and more important because it seems that they have a lot of the benefits of the omegas and the fatty acids, whereas omega 6 is essential, but we already get plenty of that in the way it's produced and manufactured, and the chemicals that are added to it make it so that by the time it reaches us, it's oxidized. And when it's used to build, manufacture cell membranes and inner organelle membranes like cardiolipin and the mitochondria, it can set the stage for some pretty disastrous health consequences when it's consumed in too large quantities.
Absolutely. And, vitamin E is very important for preventing those fats from becoming oxidized. And so, I would recommend taking an omega-3 or fatty acid supplement with vitamin E or taking them separately to prevent that oxidation of those lipids. And then, decrease your overall stress, your oxidative stress, so that there's less likelihood that they will be oxidized.
Yeah. Okay. So membrane health is very important. And first determining where like the status of your mitochondria, if they're working optimally, and if you're having problems with energy and symptoms in the organs you mentioned previously, that's probably a sign that perhaps you want to get that blood test and make sure, but you might as well focus on providing like those safety signals. Then after you do that, work on the membranes, then what?
Yeah. So, the cell membranes, and then using things like a fulvic humic acid blend to help get nutrients into the cell and toxins out. And so, a lot of people are drinking half their body weight in ounces of water. But if you're not adding electrolytes to it, you can actually dehydrate yourself more. And I get a lot of pushback on that, but it's just science, it's chemistry. I'm a chemistry and biology geek. So electrolytes, they're not sexy like hormones or mitochondria, but they're so important. Your body keeps them within a very narrow range. And what I would say to listeners, if you've had blood work and you see your potassiums within normal limits, that's what's in the blood. Potassium is mostly inside the cell. So you can do a test through LabCorp called RBC, red blood cell potassium, to give you an idea. But we really have an epidemic of potassium deficiency, all the electrolytes, but potassium and magnesium in particular. And if you're already supplementing with magnesium, make sure you add in the potassium because they work very closely together.
Yeah. And at the very least, just get in ample nutritional sources of potassium. I knew, and I've done the red blood cell magnesium blood test, RBC mag test, but didn't realize there was one for potassium also.
Yeah. So the one for magnesium, you want to be roughly 6.1 or higher. And then for potassium, I forget what the optimal range or even normal range is for that because I haven't done it in a while. But most people, if you're taking, 500 milligrams of potassium 3 times a day, then yeah, that could create cardiac problems. But if you're taking 99 milligrams, assuming you're not on any medications that are altering your potassium levels, then taking something like 99 milligrams 2 to 3 times a day is only going to help you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the order of operations of, say, using electrolytes and or humic fulvic acid sources such as Shilajit, that's my favorite. Those can go at the very beginning of the protocol. You don't, if whether or not you're in cell danger response, you can still use those, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's a great point. We hear about this supplement, this nutrient, dihydroberberine, like they're all important, depending on what your goals are and what your current situation is. But I would say if I had to make a sweeping generalization, electrolytes and a fulvic humic blend for everyone. They're going to increase energy production. They're going to help toxins get out and nutrients get in. And so, yeah, you can't go wrong using those two.
And then after you do that, then do you go to the usual like mitochondrial enhancing techniques and biohacks, or are there other steps in between those?
So typically, so like if you came to me and you just had, let's say, like three chief complaints: fatigue, brain fog, and maybe joint pain. Of course, I'm going to look at the gut, because I'll give you an example of gram-negative bacteria. They can release something called lipopolysaccharides into the bloodstream, and they're incredibly inflammatory. In fact, the labs that do testing on inflammatory cytokines, what they use in cell cultures to stimulate those cytokines is lipopolysaccharides. And so when they're released into the bloodstream, it leads to something called metabolic endotoxemia. And so basically, you're being poisoned from within. And what that does is that overwhelms the liver phase one, phase two, phase three detox pathways. So, if someone's only having one bowel movement a day or no bowel movements a day and only going once every 2 to 3 days, then we start by getting the bowels moving. And once we have that, then we add in something like electrolytes and the fulvic humic complex, because that's going to help detox even more and also increase energy production. So, everything we do, especially detox and sleep, we're very energy dependent and very energy demanding. And so a lot of people can't heal or can't detox because they don't have enough energy. So we're kind of killing a few birds with one stone by using the electrolytes and the humic fulvic complex. And so I would start by, addressing the gut. And then depending on, what your other test results show, I would say, let's say you have elevated mycotoxins. We would work on, getting those out. But one of the most important parts of detoxing mycotoxins is rehabbing the cell membranes, balancing electrolytes, because mold and mycotoxins block a hormone called antidiuretic hormone. And that hormone is the same one that coffee blocks. And that's why it makes you pee. And so if you're already electrolyte deficient and then you have something like mold toxicity, you can become hypovolemic even. So, that's not good. But supplementing with the electrolytes, humic fulvic complex is a good next step. And, from there, I would say working on your environment as well. And depending on the person, I may move the steps around a little bit. But, morning sunlight, obviously, that's something that's going to benefit everyone, no matter what your goal or objective is. And optimizing the gut, and then the lymphatic system, getting that going. And so, the heart and the circulatory system gets all the glory, but the lymphatic system is incredibly, incredibly important, and it's very dependent on movement. So it requires muscular contractions. So I have a chi machine upstairs and a vibration plate over there, to help get things moving. But it's like having your garbage disposal clogged, and then you just continue to put stuff in it. And so we don't want to try and mobilize toxins or kill too many pathogens if your drainage pathways are clogged. And so, opening up the lymphatic system and then gently supporting the liver phase one, phase two, phase three, because ultimately the lymphatic system is going to dump into the liver. And so if the liver is congested, then you're just, circling back and retoxifying yourself. And so, from there, I would say we look at stealth pathogens, typically, and your immune response. So if you have a high pathogen load, that's going to create a lot of inflammation, and oxidative stress that damages the mitochondria. So if we can bring that load down even a little bit, it allows your body to kind of take care of the pathogens on its own. But today, we're bombarded with, emails, text messages, TV, streaming this, streaming that, record this, record that, on top of, the amount of information we consume, especially if you're like you and I, constantly reading science and medical related text, then it's stressful to the nervous system. We have to try to keep that in mind, because I tell people, what you put in your mouth, yes, that's obviously very important. But what you put in your nervous system, it's kind of like your cells are eavesdropping on everything that you say and everything you put into your nervous system. And so, like, I have a colleague, it's one of the channels on Pluto, but it's just like positive animal videos, like funny, comical animal videos. And so in his IV therapy room, he has just that. He doesn't allow anyone to watch the news or anything because that's going to undo, like if your cortisol goes way up, that's going to undo some of the benefits of the IV. And, so yeah, the news, probably the best thing you can do is to stop watching the news. It's just nothing positive and half truths. I would just encourage people to do their own research. Paul Chek, I heard him say like 15 years ago that if you can walk 10 feet without someone telling you something, you didn't really need to know it. So like if I go outside and my neighbor, they're, packing up the car, throwing everything in the car to go out of town. I'm like, wait, where are you going? She's like, oh, well, there's a hurricane coming. We got to evacuate. So see, I just found out I don't need to watch the news.
No, absolutely. And it's interesting to think about the link between psychology and physiology. And people often say that there's not much link. And it seems ludicrous to me because you can just imagine all it takes is a thought to increase and modulate a whole cascade of hormones throughout your entire body. For example, if I'm thinking about going to the doctors and I'm deathly afraid of needles, by the time I get there and I'm actually getting my blood work done, my cortisol is going to be sky high simply because of my thoughts that I've been thinking over and over again, and up until from when I woke up until I got to the office.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, every thought has a physiological consequence. And, we basically have these CDs. Well, I'm dating myself, but back in the day we had CDs. And even before that, we had cassette tapes. But, we have these tapes or CDs playing in our heads. And, that's the theater of the mind. Dr. Maxwell Maltz, he's no longer with us, but he wrote a good book, Psycho-Cybernetics. And what he found was, but his patients where he thought like they were going to be over the moon excited with their results would often come in and they were kind of depressed. What's wrong? Did something not go right? Well, I thought my results would be better. And he's looking at them like, this is like my best work. But in their mind's eye, they still saw themselves as unattractive for whatever reason. So it just goes to show you, your thoughts. And James Allen, As a Man Thinketh, is another good book. So, what you focus on does expand. It's not hocus pocus. I took a good course one time called Physiological Psychology, and it was really good, to kind of tie hardcore science in with the softer sciences, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And the whole idea and concept of mindset, people tend to gloss over because it's pretty boring to think that I'm constantly changing and updating my physiology based on the thoughts I'm having. But when you realize that each thought makes a difference, you're either working towards moving to a better place or you're holding yourself back and adding a bunch of biological friction to your life simply by the thoughts you're having. And they are completely malleable too.
Absolutely. And, like you said, the physiology and the psychology are closely intertwined. And, if your physiology is off, and so this is where I have issues with cognitive behavioral therapy, because people will go, I took, I think, 11 total psychology courses. I was close to getting my doctorate in clinical psychology, but this is where I kind of got a beef with clinical psychology. Not all of them. There are some really good ones, but if you come to me and you say, I'm depressed, okay, what makes you feel that way? I don't know. Okay, well, it's $250. I'll see you next week. And then, you go home and you're feeling bad about yourself, right? And a lot of inflammatory cytokines, stealth pathogens, neurotropic viruses that like to live in the myelin sheath, heavy metal toxicity, gut dysbiosis. All those things play a hormonal balance, blood sugar balance, thyroid levels. You can have the best cognitive behavioral therapist on the planet, but if you're loaded with toxins and have mitochondrial dysfunction, I mean, you've probably seen the work of Dr. Chris Palmer, an MD from Harvard, on the bioenergetics of the brain. And I'm surprised they haven't fired the guy yet because, he's, turning psychiatry upside down. You can't say he's wrong. I mean, everything is based on research. But yeah, the bioenergetics is so incredibly important. And, to try and separate the physiology from the psychology, I mean, it goes both ways. So my psychology, if I'm really negative, can negatively impact my physiology. but my physiology is going to also impact my psychology.
Exactly. So you've mentioned infections and stealth infections several times, and those are very important and top of mind to me because I just got back from India. I had some blood work done over there, and I saw several markers that were out of range to an extent that I'm now working on addressing some of these. I'm curious how you go about identifying infections and specifically the stealth ones that otherwise would go undetected.
I have to find a balance between testing, till the cows come home and doing no testing. Because I have people that come to me who've literally paid $10,000 out of pocket for testing. And they say, "Oh, Dr. Tim, nothing's wrong." And I'm like, "Well, just humor me. Let me see." And I look at it. I'm not even off of page one yet. And I've already found like 4 imbalances. And so it's all in the eye of the beholder. And so you can test IgG and IgM antibodies. And previously, like even in school, I was taught IgG means it's a past infection. But other research, Dr. Alex Vasquez, Dr. Jacob Teitelbaum, who wrote From Fatigue to Fantastic, and Dr. Kent Holtor have shown that if the IgG levels are 3 to 4 times or more the top of the range, that indicates a currently active infection. And IgM certainly means acute infection, but you need a robust Th1, which I'll define in a second, Th1 response to change IgM antibodies to IgG antibodies. And so basically, TH stands for T helper. And the one, think of that as being the bodyguards inside your house. So if I had some bodyguards right over here, they're going to protect me if someone breaks down my front door. And then the T helper 2, think of those as being like on the perimeter of my property. And so they're going to try to prevent anyone from just getting on the premises and then getting in the door. And you want sort of a balance, right? You want your immune system to be able to go back and forth. Most people are stuck in the Th2 portion of their immune system today for a variety of reasons. But what that does is it creates the 3 A's, the allergies, the asthma, and the autoimmunity. Now, I know there's people listening saying, well, you can get autoimmunity in Th1, and they're right. You can. It's just much more likely in the Th2 portion. So things like glutathione, for example, one of the ways they work is they help to take you out of the Th2 and put you back to the Th1 or in the middle at least. And so glutathione is a very potent antiviral, but it also is a potent immune modulator. And so back to your original question about testing for pathogens, a lot of them do a really good job at hiding from the immune system. So let's take Lyme, for example. The Western blot test gives you a false negative roughly 25 all the way up to 33% of the time. That's a lot. Some numbers suggest even more. And the reason for that is the first thing the Lyme bacteria does is it turns off what's called the humoral immune response, which is essentially that Th2 response. And so that's what the Western blot tests. And so if you're testing something that's turned off, of course it's going to be negative. But if you look at a country like Japan, so when you do the Western blot, it comes back in bands. Here in the US, you need 5 bands to be considered positive. In Japan, unless it's changed, you only need 2. And so, the stealth pathogens, they have a number of mechanisms through which they can confuse the immune system. And that leads to false negative tests. So sometimes I'll just address the pathogens empirically based on symptoms, questionnaires, et cetera. If you're using like IV antibiotics or something or IV antivirals, then yeah, you would need tests because you're putting someone at risk. But if you're using mostly natural stuff at moderate doses, then you can go about it empirically. And so, most people are going to have a combination of viruses that are active. And, I just downloaded a textbook. I haven't started reading it yet, but it's called Microbes and Mental Health. And it's about this, phenomenon of pathogens affecting the central nervous system. And when the pathogens cause a cytokine storm, which became popular during the pandemic, things like interleukin 6 and TNF alpha and interleukin 1 beta, they basically punch holes in the blood-brain barrier. And that leads to molecules that should not have access to our brain. They now have direct access to it. And we have a type of white blood cell in our brains called a microglial cell. And when they're turned on, it's okay if they're turned on, but they should be turned off not long after. When they stay turned on, it leads to brain fog, memory issues, mood swings in the short term, and other things. In the long term, it leads to neurodegeneration, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. That's not the only cause, but it's one of the primary ones.
They're also highly activated during concussions or TBI.
Yeah, exactly. And I have a good case study of a client who she was being pulled behind a boat on an inner tube, and like she had her head resting on the back, like she was just kind of leaning back like that. And she went outside of the wake and she went way up in the air and came crashing down. And her head snapped back, and she had reactivated several viruses and pathogens. So it can be a car accident, it can be something like what I just described, really any stressor. So look at something like a general surgery, even if it's minimally invasive. First of all, that term is kind of misrepresentative. There's no such thing as minimally invasive surgery. Your body only knows that you're being cut, right? Like if you're invading the body, it's invasive. Sorry, surgeons, it is what it is. But if you look post-operatively, one thing that always happens is reverse T3 goes up. And reverse T3 is like metabolic brake on your body. And so if that happens, your body essentially goes into a state of torpor, hibernation, and that allows for pathogens to become reactivated. And so look at someone like, if they have Parkinson's, and, like I said, they've been getting better and better. And then they went in for a procedure for whatever reason. And then now all of a sudden they're having a major flare up. You have to look at those things and take those into consideration.
So if you get a TBI, for example, and the symptoms are especially bad, and it wasn't like it was a big hit or something like that, then you might want to consider, like, at least take notice of the symptoms, log them down, and then watch how they change, like the timeline of them changing. Because if you like overactivate the microglia cells, then you let pathogens go from dormant to active again, and that could be at least partially responsible for the symptoms you're experiencing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, yeah, the pathogens can activate the microglia and have a direct response or direct effect. And then they can punch holes, the cytokines, the inflammatory molecules in the blood-brain barrier. And so going back to the gut, if you have leaky gut or intestinal hyperpermeability, eventually that'll lead to a leaky blood-brain barrier. And so that's why, that gut-brain axis is so well connected. And now we know that for every one signal the brain sends to the gut sends 8 signals back up to the brain.
Yeah, and because gut dysbiosis and increased intestinal permeability are so common, if that can eventually lead to increased blood-brain barrier permeability, that's very significant and scary.
Absolutely. And, something I've been taking since 2009, low-dose naltrexone.
Oh, interesting.
In the past, I had Lyme and mold toxicity, but now I mostly take it prophylactically. It's not very expensive. Now, full disclosure, if you Google just naltrexone, it's going to freak you out because it was designed to help heroin addicts taper off of heroin. But the key is putting in the low dose part. And there's some free ebooks written by pharmacists and clinicians with tons of scientific references. I saw when I was still doing an in-person practice, a lady who was on medication. I think it was like $1,100 a month for her NS medications. And then she switched to low-dose naltrexone. And within 6 weeks, she went from being in a wheelchair to being able to walk independently most of the time. And it works on those microglial cells. And it also modulates that Th1, T helper 1, and Th2 response.
Interesting. So what other things could that help? Like conditions, if someone was to experience, would give them reason to look into LDN a little more?
So I'll tell you, basically anything with inflammation. Let's see, what is inflammation involved in?
It's a lot.
So I was just talking with a colleague or messaging with a colleague yesterday. He is a master's of science in nursing, and his wife's also same thing. She works at a functional medicine clinic, but he has asked me, she has Graves. What's something we can do? And I said, just ask one of the doctors or prescribers on staff to write for LDN. It's not like it's going to have a bunch of side effects. Worst case scenarios, it doesn't work. And he messaged me yesterday and said, Graves is cured. It's gone. We have opioid receptors in the body and specifically on the immune cells. And what it does is it downregulates them. And then once that period is over, it upregulates them. And so, just kind of a general concept, our nervous system cells, our immune system cells, and our endocrine system cells or hormonal cells, they share a lot of the same receptors. And you can think of those three systems as being in sort of like a three-way phone call constantly. So that's why if you look at something like rheumatoid arthritis, one of the classic symptoms is major brain fog and cognitive impairment. Well, why would that be? Back in the day, I learned it was mostly for the joints, but that's simply not true. It shares a lot of receptors, like I said. And so it can help with something like that. Even osteoarthritis, which we now know it has an immune component to it as well. Joint pain, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, any sort of spinal condition, inflammatory condition, it's going to help. It also raises natural killer cells, and natural killer cells are what keep us from getting cancer.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons to consider it. I was actually writing an article on LDN. I haven't used it, but I kind of want to experiment with it at some point. I don't have like a pressing need right now. And because of like the normal naltrexone, it is a bit scary just to play around with unless you have a reason. But yeah, it's cool to hear that there's so many different potential use cases for it.
Yeah, I mean, just to be fair, so like I've never even smoked a cigarette in my life, right? So I'm not into the illicit drug scene. But the LDN is very, very, very different than the naltrexone proper. It's a small fraction of the dosage. And so, it's not like, I've gone periods where I went off of it for like a month just because I was traveling and whatever. I notice it, but it's not like I'm in withdrawals. Like it's not like that. Doesn't have any addictive potential. And in fact, the opposite.
I always find it interesting that when you introduce certain substances to the body, it has like an effect that might seem undesirable, but what happens is the body hypercompensates and does the opposite even more, so that you end up with a baseline that's in the direction that you want to be, even though the initial effect was the opposite of what you wanted.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I get a lot of people saying, "Oh, well, Dr. Tim, I tried LDN. I had an allergic reaction to it." What's happening is, so if you're stuck in the T helper 2 dominant state, when you take LDN, low dose naltrexone, it's going to shift you back over here. So all these pathogens that were getting ignored for a really long time, the immune system is now able to attack. So what you're feeling is not a negative reaction to LDN per se. Maybe once in a blue moon, but it's very, very rare. But it's the attack on the pathogens. And so that's why, so I take the standard dose is 4.5 milligrams. But you generally start out at like 0.5 milligrams and gradually titrate up. That allows the body time to compensate. But yeah, it's very good for people with chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, you still want to address the causative factors. But for me, because, roughly 48 to 50% of people will get some form of cancer, I'm thinking I'm going to do everything I can to support my immune system.
I want to talk more about the immune system, the relationship between the immune system and the mitochondria. But first, since it can be difficult to get like good blood testing or other testing to determine if you have an infection, and especially a stealth infection, and the more tests you add on, the more expensive it becomes. Are there any other proxies you can use to determine if you have or might have something? For example, if you feel good and otherwise like haven't been sick in a long time and you see elevated white or abnormal white blood cell markers, that could be an indication. But what else? How else can we determine if we have something or might have something?
Yeah, so let's take something like eosinophils, EOS on your blood work. If they're 3 or higher, you assume 2 things, either allergies or parasites or both. So that's one way to do it, and that's just.
Could it be a food intolerance as well? Because actually that was the marker that I was looking at in my blood work, and it was like 7%, and that's considerably above the normal.
It could be. What I found is I stopped doing food sensitivity tests a while ago, and the reason being, they're not all bad, but there's only one lab that I know of that tests foods in the raw form and in the cooked form, and that's Cyrex Labs. And I don't have any financial stake in Cyrex Labs. I'm just, telling people what it does. But the more diverse, the better the alpha diversity of the gut microbiome. So the more beneficial species we have, the more foods you can tolerate. And what I found is that, if we test someone and they come back lit up like a Christmas tree, that's another stressor to their system because they're like, oh man, I can't eat this. What am I going to eat? Da, 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 da. All I can do is drink water and breathe air. And I'm like, okay, well, let's just work on the gut health because we got to do that anyways. And then at the end, if you want to really test for food sensitivities, we can. But I'll tell you a quick story. A colleague and I, this was like back in 2006, we drew blood on a patient. We sent it off to the lab. I won't throw the lab under the bus, but we put the real name and address on one tube of blood and a fake name and address on the other tube. Results came back totally different. And a lot of times, with food sensitivities, when you cook a food, that's going to change the protein. It's going to denature the protein. So it changes the immunoreactivity. But the more diverse the gut microbiome is, the more healed the mucosal lining is, the less likely you are to react to a food. But yeah, potentially food sensitivities could do that as well. Other markers, you can look at things like CD4.
Before we go on, I also used to be allergic to bees, and I was stung by a bee like 4 days before that. How long after an exposure to an allergen?
I don't know the exact time in terms of hours, but I would say that definitely played. And I'm not saying it's all of the answer, but it probably played a significant role in that marker being elevated for sure. But in terms of looking at other markers, we can check IgG and IgM to Epstein-Barr, human herpes virus 6, HHV6. But in general, one thing that's good to do. Thymic peptides, or peptide bioregulators. So the thymus gland, it's that sort of butterfly-shaped gland that controls our immune system. And as we age and when we're under stress, it involutes or shrinks. And so when I interviewed Dr. Kent Holtorf, who's kind of the godfather of peptides in the US, he said, no matter what disorder we look at, one of the commonalities is that Th1 response, it's diminished. And so with things like he has a product called Thymogen Alpha 1 that's an oral peptide that helps to regenerate the thymus gland. And at first you might think, well, if someone has an autoimmune condition or a neuroimmune condition, taking that could exacerbate their symptoms. But it actually doesn't. It actually makes them better because it's like an adaptogen for the immune system. And so what I tell people, we know most people are going to have a few pathogens. Right? I've never tested someone that didn't have it, at least a few. And so the thymic peptides, let's do those at least for a few months, get your immune system recalibrated, and then work on getting the stuff out like mycotoxins. Different mycotoxins affect different systems, but one thing they all have in common is they create immune system imbalances. And so if you're trying to fight a pathogen and you have a lot of mycotoxins in your body, you're treading water at best. And, I know this from experience. I learned the hard way, but you can't know until you know, right? And so, getting the bad stuff out and heavy metals as well. And there's a hierarchy there that's related to the molecular weight of the toxins. And again, I learned this the hard way. So back in 2007, I did like 18 chelation IVs. And my heavy metal levels barely moved. I mean, a little bit, not like you would expect them to. And it was because I didn't find out until about 3 or 4 years later, that I had a lot of mycotoxins. And so in general, so let's say you have both, because again, I've never tested someone for heavy metals that didn't have at least 3 or 4 that were moderately elevated. We want to get the mycotoxins out first, and then the metals will be much easier to get out.
Yeah. And there's definitely an order of operations here too. Like you can really work hard on eliminating the mycotoxins or the heavy metals, but if you don't realize it and you're living in a room that's contaminated with it, either of them, then you're going to be re-exposing yourself every day. And the most expensive, fanciest biohacks and products are not going to solve anything if you don't first address the environment that's reinfecting you and worsening it every single time you're there.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, one thing we have to work pretty hard on. I mean, most people need to clean their nose out more. And I don't just mean blowing your nose, but a colleague of mine is an ENT in Atlanta, and he created a product, Citra Drops. It's a nasal spray. And then I combine that with Dr. Hannah's hypertonic nasal rinse solution. I rinse my nose out 2 to 3 times a day, but you can detox the mold from your body and remediate your environment. But if mold has colonized the paranasal sinuses, you're constantly poisoning yourself from within. And so he actually, I'll tell you this quick story. A mutual colleague of ours, who's a nutritionist, she was eating healthy, working out, taking supplements. She was suicidal, and she went to see him. He cultured her nose, had major mycotoxins in her nose. He scraped the sinuses. Now she's like a new woman.
Yeah, you mentioned Dr. John Lawrence earlier, and he also has a product, I believe it's called Glutastat, and it's a nose spray you use. It's supposed to break up the biofilms to protect the pathogens, making them hard to eradicate. And then you have glutathione in there, the same nutrient you were discussing earlier, and perhaps something else to help clear the nasal passageway.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the nasal passages, he also does that functional cranial release where he puts the balloon on the end of the device and then puts it up the nose and inflates it. And it works on the dura mater. But if you look at like the videos he has on social media with like Gary Brecka, when he measures someone's FEV1, the forced expiratory volume in 1 second, it increases greatly after the procedure or technique. And so like that's what he used to heal Dana White's sleep apnea. And so, if you're even for athletes who are looking to, get that last 3 to 5% gain or edge, if you can optimize your breathing, you're going to better oxygenate your body. And so I just interviewed an ENT in Houston, Texas, who he's doing some work with the NFL, but he does a very specific type of surgery to correct enlarged turbinates and other abnormalities in the nose to optimize oxygen uptake.
Dr. Tim, how do we determine if this is necessary? Because with all these things, they can be like rabbit holes to like research and potentially implementing them. But with so much time and resources available in a day, how would you determine, for example, if it makes sense to work on your nasal passages?
So you can do a little test so if you look at mine, I have a partial collapse. So I sleep with something called nasal mutes, MUTES. You can get them on Amazon. They're like $23. They're just little pieces of silicone that go in your nose that keep your nasal passages open while you sleep. And then I have a oral appliance that brings my mandible down to 4. And so it took me from having, I think it was 23 hypoxic events per hour, because I have a pretty thick neck, from working out. So now, last time I tested, I had 11, but then I moved up on my appliance. So I'm retesting again in a few weeks. Hopefully it's down to around 5 or 6. And then I still got to do some myofunctional therapy to retrain my tongue. So it's also interconnected. Everything, like the whole body is, but especially the ears, the nose, the throat and tongue. And it all, ties in so nicely together. But I would say in general, for people who have sinus issues, the worst thing you can do is go to an antibiotic. Once in a while, it may be due to a bacteria, but the majority, sinus infections are due to fungus and or mold. And if you go to an antibiotic,
How do you know if it's one of those?
so they can culture and send it off, but most of the
But
time,
there's no at-home test like, okay, this is clearly mold because when I exhale, I see this color or something like that.
right? No, not that I know of, anyways. But if you take the antibiotic, you're killing off beneficial bacteria in the gut, and gut issues can lead to increased nasal congestion and postnasal drip. And so, breathing clean air. Like I have an air doctor running behind me. And then you can do something like Navage nasal rinse, or I use Dr. Hannah's nasal rinse. And you just change it out every 5 to 6 months. And that's something easy. It's just kind of maintenance that's good to do for anyone, even if you're not having an issue. But if you do those things and you're still having an issue, you may, want to be evaluated by someone who's well versed in functional medicine, because it could be mold and mycotoxins that's colonized the paranasal sinuses. It could be a deviated septum. It could be, a nasal collapse when you inhale, and so it could be any number of things.
Gotcha. Yeah, good to know. Are there any other links between mitochondria and the immune system that you think are worthy of discussing? I'm sure that we could talk about that for a whole nother podcast.
Yeah. So what I would say is, when you have pathogens, they create something called microbial mitochondriopathies. And all that means is it's like the pathogens are using the mitochondria as a punching bag, like a speed bag. And so we can improve mitochondrial function by decreasing the pathogens. But some people might argue the opposite. So you got to produce enough ATP to get your immune cells. So if I have a white blood cell here and the pathogen's here and it can't get over there, then it's not doing me any good. So like Quest has a test called a CD56 activity test. CD56 is a type of white blood cell, and the activity level tells you, can it get to where it needs to go? Because the absolute number, the quantity may be optimal, but if it can't get to where it needs to go to attack the pathogen, it's not really a benefit.
And then on the peptide front, are you a fan of mitochondrial peptides? Like, I think it's SS31 and what's the one I used called?
MOTS-c.
MOTS-c. Yeah.
So I haven't used those. I've heard nothing but good things. So yeah, I think those can be very beneficial, and you can take them continuously or you can cycle them. And then if you do something like invest in an AquaCure machine, the molecular hydrogen works for so many conditions, basically every condition, because the size of the molecule is so small, it can get into the mitochondria. But the peptides, if you combine it with something like an AquaCure, it's a good 1-2 punch. And then, if you're getting the right fatty acids in to make sure the membranes, the cell membrane, the nuclear membrane, and the mitochondrial membrane, make sure they're healthy, that's a good, sound, very thorough protocol.
Gotcha. Is there a risk of overclocking our mitochondria, for example, by taking some of the boosters and the peptide and then adding on molecular hydrogen if there's a reason that our body is already downregulated production?
I would say so. With the peptides, I mean, you could probably overdose on any peptide or overdo it, because anytime you increase ATP production, the cells are going to start to dump toxins and attack pathogens. So it could be an adverse reaction to the high dose, or it could just be the consequences of increasing ATP production. But I think, as long as you remain within a relatively reasonable dose, there's not going to be any safety concerns at all. And with the molecular hydrogen, I've literally had periods where I sit on the couch for 6 hours straight, breathe it in. I mean, there's no upper toxicity limit with it.
Yeah. Let me rephrase my question. The body isn't stupid, and it doesn't just decide that it's going to be lazy and throttle mitochondrial output. So when it does, it's because there's a reason that it believes conserving energy, perhaps to not generate as many reactive oxygen species or cellular exhaust, as it's sometimes called. So if we're circumventing the body's protection mechanisms of decreased output, are there potential risks of using those therapeutics?
I mean, you may consider them risks, but in general, if the cell danger response is active, it's just probably going to take that energy and divert it towards, going after the pathogens. It's unlikely.
Oh, it's still a good thing.
Yeah, so it's still a good thing. Exactly. So your immune cells, they're very dependent on mitochondrial ATP production for their activity. And what I would say, though, is you can definitely overdo it with antioxidants. And so, remember the white blood cells and the immune cells, they use oxidative stress to kill pathogens. And so that's how things like ozone work, right? But with the molecular hydrogen in general, I mean, you're going to be fine if you use that. I mean, I know one MD who healed her Lyme disease using I mean, she used a few things, but mostly molecular hydrogen.
Well, Dr. Tim, we will start to wind this one down. If people want to get a hold of you, to follow your work, to connect with you on socials, how do they go about that?
Yeah. So my website is healyourbody.org. So healyourbody.org. It's at Dr. Tim Jackson on Instagram, and on Facebook, it's Dr. Tim Jackson as well. And my podcast, if I can mention it, is the Boss Body Podcast. It's on my website, and I hope to have you on and interview you as well.
Absolutely. And I'll put a link to everything we've discussed so far in the show notes for this episode. I have a couple more questions for you before we part ways today. If there was a worldwide burning of the books and all knowledge on earth is lost, but you get to save the works of 3 teachers, who would you choose and why?
So I'm going to go with modern guys, but Dr. Kent Holtorf, Los Angeles, the peptide guy, and I mean, well versed in all aspects of functional medicine. Dr. Jack Cruz, for environmental, bringing the importance of your EMF and light environment and circadian rhythm. And then I would probably say Jeffrey Bland, because he's done so much for functional medicine.
Perfect. What is one thing that you're interested in or researching these days?
Yeah, so I would say peptide bioregulators. I'm still relatively new to them. I'm learning more about them. I've interviewed 2 people about them now. I haven't used hardly any of. I haven't used any bioregulators myself, but there's such important signaling molecules, and depending on which ones you're using, you can cycle them, so it's not like something you have to take constantly. And I think, like, if you look at something like epitalon, which is technically a peptide and not a bioregulator, but you can take it for 10 days every 6 months, and it's going to have pretty profound anti-aging benefits. And you can stack it with something like the thymic peptides. So one of the hallmarks of aging is the shrinking of the thymus gland. So if you can keep the immune system robust and help the telomeres with the epitalon, then that's a good 1-2 punch. And a lot of people don't have the finances or can't dedicate the resources to take in that many supplements, and I get it. They're expensive. So look at things like natural sunlight, and then peptide, where you can take for literally 20 days out of the year and still get pretty significant benefits.
Absolutely. I wrote an article on bioregulators. They're very hard to get because they're always out of stock, but when you can get them, the research coming out of Russia on them is pretty interesting and promising. And yeah, I love that you can just take it for very short periods every once in a while and get benefits. And I've heard there's several studies coming out of the US soon to validate the Russian reports and research as well.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure.
Okay, what's one thing that your tribe does not know about you?
So after my sophomore year in undergrad at Wake Forest University, I went on a trip to the Republic of Georgia to work with refugee children from Abkhazia in Tbilisi, Georgia. And we were there for 10 days. And so we worked on, improving, like, it wasn't an orphanage, but kind of an orphanage, you can think of it that way, improving the structure, just spending time with them, letting them know people cared. And yeah, so I don't share that with a lot of people, but I very much enjoyed that.
Well, how would you like to wrap up our episode together today? Any final words or parting thoughts?
Yeah, I would say health and optimal health doesn't have to be as complicated as a lot of times we make it. I mean, yeah, we went down a lot of biochemical rabbit holes and biohacking rabbit holes. But if you look at something like a strong sense of purpose, that and healthy social connections. I'm not promoting smoking, but if you look at the blue zones, sometimes you see people living to 105 or 110 who smoked, but they had a strong sense of purpose and they had healthy social connections. And I think, those 2 things, like, now we're more disconnected than ever. Like, the neighbors on this side of me, I've seen them maybe twice in 2 years. And so, like, we need, more communication We need to realize it takes a village, and we need to stop arguing as much and lend a helping hand.
Perfect way to wrap this one up. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and looking forward to another conversation at some point.
Thanks so much for having me, Nick. I really appreciate it. And thanks for the work that you're doing.
I hope that this has been helpful for you. If you enjoyed it, subscribe and hit the thumbs up. I love knowing who's in the 1% committed to reaching their full potential. Comment 1% below so that I know who you are. For all the resources and links, meet me on my website at mindbodypeak.com. I appreciate you and look forward to connecting with you. As a reminder, the information depicted in this video is for information purposes only. Please consult your primary healthcare professional before making any lifestyle changes.